last week, we took a detour from exploring the fruit of the Spirit to highlight what research has shown to be the difference between spirituality and religion. But in thinking about that, I realized that it wasn't really a detour, and that I should have been highlighting that difference from the beginning of this series. I've been saying all along that the qualities Paul labels as fruit of the Spirit can each be twisted into a vice rather than a virtue if not guided by love, which Paul puts first on his list. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I've also emphasized that none of them can grow in us fully if we try to go it alone. They become sustainable more than just a one-off opportunity, only in the midst of a community that's trying to do the same thing, holding each other accountable, working together. I've said that they are the fruit of God's Spirit, the Spirit of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, but also of any faith that recognizes love as the essential nature of the divine. What last week's discussion surfaced for me was that what Paul is talking about is the fruit not just of the Spirit, but of spirituality, which can be attached to a particular religion with a unique expression of that spiritual essence, but it does not have to be. As science is proving, spirituality and religion are different things. While they can enhance each other, it's the spirituality part, not the religious part, that produces the benefits that science is now uncovering. In the research of Dr. Lisa Miller and others, the benefits proven were substantial improvements in mental, physical, and social health, with vastly lower rates of substance use and abuse, depression, suicide, and all kinds of extreme risk-taking. The study of spirituality with the tools of social and medical science is in its infancy right now, and I think that's in part because everyone thought of religion and spirituality as the same thing, and the faith claims of any particular religion are beyond the scope of science to be able to study. But I will put down my marker here and say that I believe future research will show that the specific attributes and behaviors providing all those protective effects in spiritual people are exactly the things on Paul's list: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Remember the definition of spirituality that developed out of their research. This is from Dr. Miller's book, The Spiritual Child, on page 25. Spirituality is an inner sense of relationship to a higher power that is loving and guiding. The word we give to this higher power might be God, nature, spirit, the universe, the creator, or other words that represent to us the divine presence. But the important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher presence. Close quote. As all that was mulling around in my head, I remembered a man named Jack at Trinity, the mega church that I served as an associate pastor in Florida. My title there was the Minister of Nurture and Discipleship, and my main contribution to that role was developing a program called the Institute of Spiritual Growth, which pulled together the hundreds of groups and activities already happening at that church, and then tried to see where there might be holes where someone seeking their spiritual formation couldn't get a piece of it. One of the holes I found was in opportunities for retreats focused on spiritual growth. So I worked with a team to create one. Jack, a man in his mid to late 50s, was on that team. But I remember vividly the day that a true spiritual awakening fell on Jack. While we were still just in the process of outlining the broad contours of the retreat, he pulled me aside one day, almost jumping with glee. "It's relationship," he said, over and over and over again. "That's 100% it. It's all about relationship." He was practically dancing around the room. And from that point onward, he was a changed man. Jack was always a good man. But after that revelation, he was also a happy man, an exuberant man, a joyful man. He had more energy than someone half his age. It's about relationship. The last line in Dr. Miller's spirituality definition reads, read it again, "The important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher presence." I think the way to view Paul's fruit of the Spirit is to see them as the fruit that begins to grow and flourish in spiritual development, in realizing not just that there is a vast power in the universe beyond ourselves, or even in recognizing that vast power to be benevolent instead of neutral, but to realize that that power is at once both vast and intimate. That God, in whatever way we name that idea, is already in relationship with all that is, including us, and we just need to tap into it, to acknowledge the relationship in order to receive the benefits. While the spirituality research has shown through brain scans and other markers that there are times in human development when that comes more naturally. First as toddlers beginning to explore our world, and then most profoundly from the ages of 14 to 25. Jack is evidence that it can come at other times as well. My father was also like Jack. While we were in church every Sunday, even when we were traveling, and while he served in many official church roles, it wasn't until he was 46 years old, the year before he died, that the financial stresses of the late 1970s and a daughter in college made him pick up the phone at 1 a.m. and call a quiet, simple man in the church named Bob Barrett. The call got Bob out of bed, and my father said simply to him at 1 in the morning, "Bob, I need what you have." Bob told my father basically what Jack had said. It's all about relationship. And within a couple of months, my father was preaching about his changed life in our church, the first and only sermon he ever preached. His text was 1 Corinthians 13. "If I speak with the tongues of mortals and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." The love chapter, perhaps Paul's most eloquent description of the fruit of the Spirit. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. 1 Corinthians 13 soon appeared on his desk at school and everywhere else he could work it in. It's on the small marker covering his ashes and on the kidney-shaped granite bench that sits on our family plot in South Newfane, Vermont. It's about relationship, because by definition, you can't love by yourself. I think all of that helps greatly when we get to the fruit that is called goodness in some translations and generosity in others. There are a number of different Greek words for good. The root of this one in Galatians 5 is agathos. You know anybody named Agatha? That's what their name means, goodness. It's a pretty broad term, just like it is in English. You can use agathos to talk about people, things, conditions, qualities, deeds, times, seasons, and more. Thayer's Greek lexicon, which is what I frequently use for dives into Greek words, says that the only way to really know which kind of good the word agathos is talking about is from the context in which it appears. In Galatians 5, the form of the word as a noun, as goodness, is rare. It appears only once in all of classical Greek literature outside of the Bible, and only 4 times in the Bible, all of them coming from Paul. One is in his fruit of the Spirit list. Another references that list. A third mentions the goodness of God, and the last one is just in a general passage in Romans 15. So those aren't much help in terms of defining the word by its context. Muddying the waters for goodness as a noun is that it can also be translated as kindness, which is represented by a different word we've already talked about on the list. But as an adjective, agathos appears much more frequently in the Bible, 102 times to be exact. So I went hunting for a passage that could be more helpful in trying to figure out what Paul meant by goodness that might not be covered by the many other good qualities that he has on that list. The most helpful context I could find is the passage that Kim read from Matthew 25, often referred to as the parable of the talents. While we usually hear the phrase, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," at funerals, the phrase comes from this parable, as the master, who represents God in the parable, praises 2 out of 3 servants with that phrase as they're welcomed into the master's joy. The key bit of translation needed here for modern readers is that a talent in Jesus' day is a monetary unit, and a large one. 1 talent was more than 15 years of wages for a laborer. Even the guy only given 1 talent was entrusted with a lot of money. The one who got 5 talents was trusted with over 75 years worth of wages, which was more than twice the average lifespan at the time. This is a parable that doesn't sit well with a lot of people for a lot of reasons, including fans of the business book called Just Don't Lose the Money. The one servant singled out for particularly harsh treatment, who is called wicked and lazy instead of good and faithful, is the one who didn't put his master's money at risk. He buried it, stuck it in his mattress, and then gave it back when he was asked. There are quite a few people thinking about doing exactly that right now as I stand here. I mean, even Warren Buffett's currently holding a record cash position of $335 billion. The other thing that many find problematic is that the guy who focused on protecting the money got it taken from him and given to others. And the parable ends with a moral that doesn't sound particularly savory in a world run by billionaires. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Wait a minute. On the one hand, that sounds like the way it is today. But if the master is supposed to represent God, it doesn't sound like something the one who's been advocating for the poor for the past 3 years should be highlighting, especially given the judgment passage that follows this parable about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and caring for those sick and in prison. In fact, the context for all of Matthew 24 and 25 is the question that Jesus' disciples raise at the beginning of Matthew 24. In verse 3, when Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Nothing in the 2 chapters it takes Jesus to answer that question should make anyone want to be around at that coming, unless you've been on the right side of the 3 parables that Jesus tells one after the other in those 2 chapters. The first, from the end of Matthew 24, is for those in charge of feeding others in their care. Upon Jesus' return, those leaders had better be hard at work feeding people, or the parable says there will be literal hell to pay. The second, which opens Matthew 25, is about the wise and foolish bridesmaids, with the wise paying attention and being prepared for delays, while the foolish make no such preparations, only to then be shut out of the delayed wedding. And then comes the parable of the talents as the last, before the famous scene of judgment where the sheep are separated from the goats, where Jesus says, "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. As you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Throughout those 2 chapters, the people who are on the wrong side of each parable, as well as on the wrong side in the final judgment, are treated very harshly. And that's a sermon unto itself for another time. But to the question of what does it look like to be good and faithful, which are both fruit of the Spirit, we just need to pull back to a balcony view of the earth a bit to get a clearer picture. I don't think the parable of the talents is about investing strategies. And I also don't think it's saying that those who lack money are therefore lazy and should get even the little they have taken away from them. While Jesus had wealthy followers, the crowds that thronged him were not looking for how to trade their goods for a better profit. Those with such means have always been a tiny fraction of the world's population. So we can take that interpretation of the parable off the table. The sin of the wicked and lazy servant was not refusing to take risks with his master's money. The money is a metaphor for something else. Here's how I came to see that this week. Remember what a talent was. It was money, yes. But whether you were talking about a talent or a denarius or the widow's mite, when you go to find out the value of any monetary unit you find in the Bible, there will be a note that'll tell you what it was worth in relationship to the average daily wage. Money represented labor. Days and years worked to be able to stay alive, feed a family, and get up every day to go out and do it all again. Remember, a talent was worth 15 years of a person's wages in Jesus' day. With the average lifespan of a man in that place and time being just 35, if a man started working at age 12, which was at their bar mitzvah, that's when a boy became a man, The servant who was put in charge of 5 talents was in charge of at least 3 lifetimes of income. What the servants were entrusted with was the livelihood of workers, and the servants were charged with increasing that value. We're told the master was gone a long time. Upon his return, 2 servants had worked hard to improve the wages and therefore the lives of those entrusted to them. But one did nothing, making even his own labor worthless. The one who buried the talent got what he had taken from him, not because he himself had little and did not work. He was in essence fired from his job for refusing to better the situation of the poor whose wages were entrusted to him. Imagine if the person managing your 401k kept all the money in cash for your entire career. You would not be happy about that. As to what putting those talents to good use looks like, it follows in the judgment of the sheep and the goats, which immediately follows. Those who lack food and health and clothing, those who are strangers in the land, those who end up in prison, can't support themselves. To use the talent to turn their lives around puts them back in the workforce and benefits them as individuals and as society as a whole, both economically and socially. Over a long period of time, which is what the master was gone, that easily doubles the value put in. It's compound interest, but with people. For example, in 2019, the Economic and Research Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, found that during a slowing economy, a $1 billion increase in SNAP benefits, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that provides food purchasing assistance for low and no income individuals and families. A $1 billion investment in SNAP would increase the GDP by $1.54 billion, support 13,560 jobs, and boost income in the agriculture industries by $32 million. Turns out, making sure the poor can buy food is not only morally right, it's economically wise. The parable of the talents is about managers being good stewards of a person's labor, which entails care for the whole person. I think the message of the parable is something that we hear every Christmas in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. When the ghost of Scrooge's former business partner, Jacob Marley, shows up in his old partner's home at the beginning of the story, he comes dragging a heavy chain that's made up of all his sins in life. Marley comes to warn his old friend that his ponderous chain was formed by Marley's own insistence in life on putting profits over the lives of others, and that the chain awaiting Scrooge at his passing is already longer than Marley's is. When Scrooge objects by saying, "But you were a good man of business," Marley's ghost explodes in anger. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." In the dealings of their trade, Scrooge and Marley made a lot of money. They doubled and tripled their money and likely more. But as the story unfolds, we see that they did so by extorting their trading partners, exploiting their workers, and keeping all the profits for themselves. Now, Scrooge might have read the parable of the talents and found justification for doing just that. He didn't read anything around it, while beating up employees like Bob Cratchit if they didn't sacrifice everything to make that profitability greater. but is the prelude to Jesus' scene of the final judgment. The other parables that lead into the parable of the talents, and the 3 years of his ministry that have come before. It's clear that what the servants in the parable were charged with had more to do with the stewardship of workers, both their wages and their human welfare. A good and faithful servant works to make their lives better. Goodness, as a fruit of the Spirit, is the generosity of God flowing through us, that considers the health and well-being of the whole, that recognizes any resources we have, from our money to our time to our labor to our skill, are given to us in trust to do God's work in the world. Because what is done to one is done to all, because we are all in a web of relationship with the God that is. Once we realize that it's all about relationship, that fruit of goodness and all the rest of it grows naturally in us, as it finally did in Scrooge as he reconciled with his nephew. And we then can naturally become both good and faithful servants ourselves. Amen.